Hi, my case study is on Langston Hughes as the creative person and the Harlem Renaissance as the creative environment. Okay, so timeline of Langston Hughes' life. Langston was born February 1st, 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. Langston's parents divorced when he was young, and his father moved to Mexico, and his mother moved around trying to find jobs. So that left Langston to spend a large part of his younger years living with his grandmother. When Langston lived with his mother, she introduced a love of arts and theater to him. In 1916, Langston was voted class poet by his classmates. And in 1920, Langston graduates from high school and decides to move to Mexico to live with his father. And on the train to Mexico, Langston is inspired by the Mississippi River to write this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. A year later, his poem is published in the Crisis magazine, which was a magazine published during the Harlem Renaissance era. And in 1922, Langston moves to Harlem. He had attended Columbia University for a year, but he encountered racism and he was very unhappy there, so he dropped out of college. And then in 1923, he decides to board a ship to work, and he goes to Africa, and then later on he works in Paris for a while, and then he eventually moves back to Harlem. In 1925, he wins a prize for poetry in Opportunity magazine. In 1926, he decided to go back to college, and he attended classes at Lincoln University, and he publishes his first book of poetry, The Weary Blues. In 1929, he graduates from Lincoln University, and in 1930, he publishes his first novel, Not Without Laughter. In 1931, he takes a poetry tour of the South and does a lot of other things. In fact, in 1936, his play Mulatto became the longest running Broadway play by an African American. He won several awards. And then in 1967, on May 22nd, he died of lung cancer. Okay, so the Great Migration was during World War I, and I've included this because it is what actually led to the Harlem Renaissance. Because of the war, there were jobs available in the North, and African Americans left the South to leave behind the Jim Crow laws and for better economic opportunities in the North. And I'm going to show a short video that kind of explains more about the Great Migration.
Hi, my name is Yahuwah Williams. I'm a professor of history, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Great Migration. The Great Migration occurred in the decades after the Civil War and witnessed the movement of hundreds of thousands of African Americans from out of the South to communities in the North and West. Historians generally talk about the Great Migration in two waves, one from 1910 to 1940 and one that lasts roughly from 1940 to 1970, when the Great Migration is said to have ended. Historians estimate that between 1910 and 1940, as many as 1.5 million African Americans migrated from the South to northern cities. The first wave of the Great Migration accompanied a flowering of Black intellectual and artistic expression that became known nationally as the Harlem or Black Renaissance. Several factors contributed to the Great Migration, including the lack of opportunity for African Americans to make a stable living in the South. Economic inequality in the form of unfair labor practices, such as sharecropping, tenant farming, and the crop lien system, compelled many African Americans to move in hopes of more equitable treatment in northern factories. The Great Migration was also an important precursor to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Finding little relief from racial discrimination in the North, African American civil rights leaders had to fight for full equality across the nation. In recent years, scholars have documented a reverse migration from northern cities back to the South.
Okay. So now we move into the Harlem Renaissance. And again, I have a video for you, and this video can explain the Harlem Renaissance much better than I can.
Throughout the 1920s, Harlem experienced a cultural and intellectual explosion that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Who was involved in the Harlem Renaissance? What was the ultimate impact? Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City which has a very large African American community. Harlem became a destination for African Americans throughout the early 1900s as part of the Great Migration. As more blacks made Harlem their home, it increasingly became well known as an African American cultural center. Poets, writers, artists, musicians, and philosophers were all key parts of the movement. One of the key components of the Harlem Renaissance was music. Jazz performers including Jelly Roll Morton, Fats Waller, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong perfected their music, which became very popular amongst white audiences. It was also during this era when the piano was incorporated into the jazz style of music. Traditionally, jazz bands had included primarily brass instruments. Intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey argued and debated issues of racism, ethnic pride, and other topics related to African American life. Poets such as Langston Hughes introduced a new form of poetry known as jazz poetry. African American literature of the era included themes such as how slavery had impacted the African American culture and how to combat stereotypes of Black Americans. African American clothing also drastically changed during the Harlem Renaissance. Black men started wearing zoot suits. These were suits which featured long coats with padded shoulders and wide lapels. Women wore low-slung dresses, silk stockings, and open-toed slippers. Both genders wore hats with wide brims. Leopard skin items also became popular, as they were seen as a connection to traditional African garb. The Harlem Renaissance had a profound impact on the United States, as well as the world. African American artists, musicians, and writers began to be respected on an international level. Not only were white audiences listening to and enjoying black music, but white composers and musicians began incorporating African American rhythms and harmonies into their own pieces. The Harlem Renaissance also helped to change the world's perception of African Americans. Prior to the 1920s, blacks were thought of as uneducated farmers. However, thanks to the Harlem Renaissance, a new image of sophisticated and intellectual African Americans began to emerge.
Okay. So for the creative characteristics of Langston Hughes, I went to Torrance's Creative Positives that show his creativity, his ability to express feelings and emotions, his articulateness in role-playing and storytelling, his enjoyment of and ability in music and rhythm, expressive speech, humor, richness of imagery and informal language, originality of ideas and problem solving, and emotional responsiveness. And now I have a video that will show Langston Hughes reading his poem, The Weary Blues, with the jazz accompaniment. I'm not going to play the whole video, but I just wanted to give you a sense of his creativeness in his expressing his feelings and emotions, and the music and the rhythm, and his imagery and language.
The suns are setting. This is what I'm gonna sing. Suns are setting. This is what I'm gonna sing. I feel the blues are coming. I wonder what the blues will bring. Rolling a drowsy syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon. I heard a Negro play. Down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of a one-bulb light, he did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues. Swaying to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, raggy tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues, coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues.
Okay. So here are a couple of poems by Langston Hughes that when I'm doing my research about him, they kind of stuck with me, and I wanted to include them here. And if you have not read any of his stories, novels, of his poems, I encourage you to pick up a book of his and read. He's a very prolific and creative writer, and I've learned a lot about him, and I'm glad that I did this case study on him. And I'm going to finish up with some photos of Langston Hughes in the Crisis magazine, where he published a lot of his poetry, and just some random pictures from the Harlem Renaissance. I hope you enjoyed learning about the creative person Langston Hughes and the equity and diversity issue of the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. Thank you for listening.